Hi, I'm Hannah McClelland. The mini lesson that I did is over classical conditioning. So this would be taught to either high school juniors and seniors, so like AP psychology, or in college as an introductory psychology course, so like Psych 101. The unit would be learning and memory, or you could break it up just into learning and do your unit on that. So my objectives, I had three. The first is that students will be able to understand and explain both Ivan Pavlov and Edwin Twitmeyer's contribution to the understanding of conditioning. Students will be able to identify the neutral stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned response, and conditioned stimulus. And then students will also be able to look at real-life story problems and identify those same elements of classical conditioning. So the materials needed for this lesson include a projector or a smartboard or something like that, just so you can show a short little video clip and a worksheet with examples of classical conditioning from real life that students can go ahead and label the elements of conditioning. So my agenda I broke into a few different sections. First, just like an introduction, get students excited about the lesson and just settled into the day to learn. So first I would just introduce classical conditioning as a concept, let them know like what's going on. So I would want to give a real life example that most people can probably relate to. So something would be like driving by your favorite restaurant and feeling hungry. So I think most people would probably be able to relate to that in one way or another. And so this will create a meaningful learning experience because they have prior knowledge that they can activate while learning in this lesson. So then to kind of get students excited and ready to learn, I'll show just a quick little video. It's about less than a minute. If you've ever seen the TV show The Office, there's a cold open where Jim is pranking Dwight, like just very classically. And so what he does is he reboots his computer, and every time he does that, he asks Dwight if he'd want a mint. And then after a bunch of different repetitions of that, he reboots his computer, and Dwight just holds his arm out for the mint. And it's pretty funny, and it's a really good example of classical conditioning. So hopefully that'll get students ready to learn. So then I will dive into the core of the mini lesson, and that'll be me just kind of explaining what classical conditioning is, getting students familiar with that. It'll be a little bit more lecture-based just for that section, but then I'll also do application and student-based activities later on. So I would start by just explaining generally what these concepts are. So a stimulus is something that happens or is presented where a response is something that is a reaction to that stimulus. So those terms generally, and then also conditioned and unconditioned. Unconditioned is just something that is very naturally occurring. You don't need to learn it. Whereas conditioned is something that does need to be learned, and that's where classical conditioning comes into play. So I will go through two different famous experiments. So Ivan Pavlov, which everybody maybe has heard of, most psychologists or people like in psychology, maybe 101 in college will have learned it in high school or just something like that. And then a less known study by Edwin Twitmeyer, who was actually the first to discover classical conditioning. And while I'm doing this, I'll be talking about it, but also to make it a little bit more interesting and to appeal to different types of learners, I will be drawing on the whiteboard or the smartboard or the chalkboard or whatever the classroom has, so students have that visual too. So basically, Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist that was studying digestion in dogs, and he noticed that before he would even present his dogs with food, they would start to salivate. So he set up this experiment to see what was going on. So basically what happened is the first time he rang the bell, nothing happened. So that is very neutral. It is your neutral stimulus. Again, a stimulus is something that happens or is presented. I just wanted to make sure I was saying it in the same terms. So then I broke this down into before, during, and after conditioning, so it's very clear. So the before conditioning is what I just talked about, that neutral stimulus, and then also the step with the unconditioned stimulus and response. So the unconditioned stimulus is something that is naturally presented, like food, and you naturally get a response like salivation. So then during classical conditioning, you will pair up that neutral stimulus, in this case the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, so the stimulus that is presented that is naturally occurring like the food. So you pair up those two things and you get, what do you expect? The salivation. So when you present the food, the salivation. If you pair it with the bell, what happens is after a certain amount of repetitions, after just hearing the bell, the dog would salivate. So they have learned that association. So this unconditioned turns into conditioned. So the bell, which was neutral, is now the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is now a conditioned response. So what I would really want to point out to my students, there are a few different things that can be confusing about this. The salivation is present in multiple steps but labeled differently. So before conditioning, it is an unconditioned response because it happens naturally in response to something that would just normally make you do that. Whereas down here, it is a conditioned response because it is happening in the presence of something, the bell, that would not naturally make you salivate. So that is Ivan Pavlov's experiment. I would definitely make sure to get students' reactions, see if they're understanding, maybe explain it one more time, just talk about without the terms or anything, just this is what Pavlov did, and then maybe review the terms if they needed it. And then I would also, for the students that like kind of formulaic stuff, put it up like this. It's the exact same thing but without the pictures. And I wouldn't erase anything so they could see them side by side. And then I would also go through Edwin Twittmeyer's experiment. So Edwin Twittmeyer's was pretty cool. He was actually the first to discover classical conditioning, but many people think it's Pavlov, but that's just because his was the most memorable and it actually quantified it, which was really cool. So here we'll talk about Twittmeyer. So what he did is he was studying the knee-jerk reaction. So if you've ever been to the doctor's office and they hit your knee and your knee jerks up, that's what the knee-jerk reaction is. So he was testing it with a lab assistant, and what he would do is he would have a timer, and when it went off, then the lab assistant would know to hit the patient in the knee. So in this case, the first time you ring the timer, nothing happens, right? You just hear a timer, you go on with your day. And naturally occurring, if you get hit in the knee, your knee is going to jerk, you're going to respond to that. So that's before the conditioning. During the conditioning is when you pair up the timer with the knee jerk reaction. So you have the timer go off, you hit the knee, and your knee jerks. In this case, this is not what he was trying to discover. He was doing something totally different. And what he noticed is that when the timer would go off, eventually, after so many repetitions, the patient would jerk their knee before they even got hit with the hammer. So, in terms of conditioning, you have the timer as a neutral stimulus, the hammer and the knee jerk as the unconditioned stimulus and response. When you're going through the process of conditioning, that's when you pair that neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus to get that response. And then afterwards, after just hearing the timer, you do the knee-jerk reaction, so that will be a conditioned stimulus and response. So classical conditioning can be a little bit confusing for people that are learning it for their first time. And if we're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, so you're just getting the understanding level, and I really want to help my students move up into that application level, apply and analyze. So what we're going to do after the kind of lecture-based explanation part is have students get into groups of 3 to 5 and do a worksheet. So what I did is I made a worksheet with 6 different examples. The first one is actually Pavlov's dog, so they have something to be familiar with. And they will go through and they'll label the neutral stimulus, conditioned and unconditioned stimulus and response. So with that, they'll be in their groups. They'll get this cooperative peer learning experience. While they're filling it out, I'll be walking around, making sure they're on the right track, seeing if they have any questions, all that good stuff. I really want to be able to have the students work together and exhibit that social development. So that's why instead of just having them do it individually, I have them do it in groups. And also since it's a harder concept, then it'll give them a little bit more practice too and more help. So with this, I had 6 different real-life examples. So one that I thought was really cool was Jaws. If you've ever seen the movie, what they did is they would play the scary music every time you'd see the shark. It was actually really cool because they didn't have a whole lot of money for the movie, so they couldn't show the shark a whole bunch. So what they would do is they'd play the music, and you would pair that, you would know that the shark was coming, so that they could just play the music and you would get that fear response. So in this case, in terms of classical conditioning, the first time you hear the music, there's really no response. The first time you see the shark, you get really scared. That's naturally occurring. When you pair the music and the shark, you get that fear response. So eventually, after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is the music, and you feel that fear, which is the conditioned response. So that's one of the examples of the problems that will be on the worksheet for students to do. And then I like to over-prepare instead of under-prepare. So what I would do is I would also have an opportunity for the students to have a little fun. So they'd be put in the same groups, or we could switch it up, just maybe see how they're feeling and how they're working. And if they're working well with the people in their groups, we'll have them stay, and they will be tasked with coming up with their own example of classical conditioning. And if we're running short on time, we can just have them then share out with the class. But if we have some time left, then we can have a little fun with it, or maybe we can make it an assignment, and they can actually like film them acting out that scene. So then they would present it like the next day in class or at the end of class. So they can not only apply their knowledge with like just a worksheet, but they can also create something and have fun with it and really internalize and elaborate on that information. So that is my mini lesson on classical conditioning for psychology class.